Meet Tim Wildsmith, who in his own words is
a pastor and a writer, and for the last few years I have been a YouTuber.
Tim is that rare breed that loves not just the Bible, but specifically Bible translations.
Can you tell that I get excited about this? I get so geeked out and nerdy over these things, man.
In this conversation, Tim explains why we have so many English translations of the Bible.
It starts with going all the way back to a couple hundred years before even the King James Version.
Understanding the differences between these translations.
Word for word, literal translations of the Bible versus thought for thought.
And finally, the question I really wanted to dig into.
My answer to which one should you use for memorization is...
My understanding is there's like 400 English translations of the Bible. Is that correct? Like, why is it that we have so many translations of the Bible?
I think that's a really great question. It starts with going all the way back to a couple hundred years before even the King James Version. Most Bibles at that time were Latin, was the main language of the Roman Catholic Church, and as English became a more prominent language, people started saying, we need to have the Bible in our language. And even before the King James, a lot of people think the King James Version was the original English version of the Bible, but actually there were already a couple dozen translations that were being developed, and what happened back then was somebody over here would be working on it. We didn't have the internet. They didn't know, so somebody over here would be working on it. So you had all these translations popping up. And then, back then, people would get persecuted for translating the Bible in English, and some of them were martyred, and so somebody else would pick up their work, and they would edit it and add to their thing. So you have all these different translations popping up. And then now, in modernity, it is really digging into all of the textual research called textual criticism, the different Greek manuscripts of the Bible, the different Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible, and people are going, okay, we've got to come up with the right translation. We want to do it the best way. And then we get into this whole world of translation philosophy. So like the differences between, a lot of people think about this translation spectrum. I talk about this in my book, like word for word, literal translations of the Bible versus thought for thought, dynamic translations of the Bible. So there are some translations that sound, when you're reading them, the way you and I are talking right now, modern English. There are other translations that sound a little bit more archaic and a little bit older. And so in between there, you just have lots of different things, lots of different groups of scholars from different pockets around the world who are translating into English, and then it just grows and grows and grows. And eventually what's happened now is that over the past 20, 30 years, there's about 10 to 15 English translations of the Bible that have kind of risen to the top, that are the most commonly read, the most commonly shared, and those are the ones that I really talk about in my book that I've got coming out about Bible translations, to kind of focus in and talk about the differences and really fine-tune. But you're right, there are so many more out there that are just little projects here and there. Some of them are individual people working on a translation of the Bible. Some of them are smaller groups of people, and then some of them are even larger groups, teams of people who are translating together. It's a fascinating world for sure.
Absolutely. You know, and I've seen that spectrum before, going from word to word for word, and thought for thought. And I think most people, when they approach their Bible, they're not actually thinking about that most of the time, would be my guess.
Sure. Yeah.
But as you look at translations, like how does that process work? Like when that person or that group of people come together, are they specifically thinking about, okay, are we going to do a word for word or a thought for thought? And do you have any idea behind the scenes how that process works?
Yeah. So most translations will start with a group of people sitting down, and one of the first decisions is, what is our goal for this? It's called a translation philosophy. And some come up with different names, like back in the 1970s, I think it was the NKJV, the New King James translators, they coined the phrase optimal equivalence. They said, we have found the optimal way to translate Bibles, you know? So they go at it with that in mind. And what that happens, so if you want it to be more word for word, you're looking at, as you can imagine, ancient Hebrew, some Aramaic, and Greek. There is a lot of work that has to be done to put that into readable English. I'm talking about, there are words back then that don't exist now. We don't have a one-to-one correlation. There are words, many people know that there's a lot of different words for love in Greek, different words that mean different types of love. And then you get into word order, syntax, punctuation, types of speech, poetry, prose, all of those things. So you have to study all of that. And so on one side of the spectrum, they're going, we're going to keep it as close to the original as possible. That would be a word for word or a formal equivalence. They're trying to match the form of the original as closely as possible, which obviously that's a good way to do it, to match it as closely as possible. That's a great translation. But often what happens is that one will sound, the word that gets thrown out is wooden. It'll sound a little bit, it doesn't sound exactly the way we speak. And then way over here, you go, okay, now we want a thought for thought, a dynamic or functional equivalence translation. We still care about accuracy to the original texts, but we want to put this in a way that actually sounds readable and understandable and clear for today's readers. The argument there would be, if it's not understandable, if it's not clear, then people aren't going to be able to understand it and apply it to their lives and really let it sink in. And then there's a balance. So there's like, and the hard part, Josh, is that there's not a decided, like, here's where each one falls. It's pretty subjective. There's a guy here on YouTube named R. Grant Jones who literally has like a scientific method where he measures certain verses against the original languages and gives them a score of literalness. It's really, really fascinating. So that's what they do. But when they sit down, they kind of choose from the beginning, we're going to go for this angle. Like I said, the NKJV, it's a pretty word-for-word translation. They stuck as close as they can. Something like the New Living Translation or the NIV, that is specifically, the NIV has a great story. It was a businessman in the Pacific Northwest of the United States who was trying to share the gospel with his colleagues, his coworkers, and he was using the King James Version, and somebody one day laughed at him, and they're like, nobody talks like this anymore. So he went to his pastor, and over the course of about a decade, they started working on what would eventually become the New International Version because it was designed to be more readable for everyday folks. Back then, it was in the 1960s and 70s. And so they started with the idea of making a translation that was more readable. Can you tell that I get excited about this? I get so geeked out and nerdy over these things, man.
That's awesome. No, I mean, that's why I'm excited to have you like sharing part of your excitement about this. I did a project, I guess it's about a couple months ago and it was a little harder than I thought it would be, where I actually did word count for every book of the Bible in different translations.
Yeah.
And I was shocked by a couple things. One of them was the fact that, the like longest and shortest book of the Bible is different based on translation because of how many words they use. But the other one was, and this speaks to a little bit of what you were talking about, like in a lot of translations, the book of Psalms is the longest by word count. But in the original text, Psalms is actually much, much shorter.
Yeah.
And in part, I guess, because when we're translating in English, it's like that poetry, we've got to use 5 words to explain that one word, would be my guess. I mean, am I making that a right assumption there?
That's right. There's actually, back behind me on my shelf is a set of the Hebrew Bible translated by a Jewish man, a Hebrew scholar named Robert Alter, and he talks about how you really have to understand the Hebrew language to really grasp what it's going for. And so he's a little bit critical, honestly, of American and British scholars who translate when like Hebrew is their 3rd or 4th language that they've studied, as PhDs, where he's like, a lot of us who grew up with this, we have a bit of a feel for it, and we can say more with fewer words because of the way that it's written. And you have to understand that. You have to really grasp that. And so that makes it really interesting when you're reading. You can read certain translations of the Bible, and I'll do it. I mean, I'll grab a Bible and I'll read a psalm, and then I'll go grab another translation. And I'm like, oh, that translation feels more poetic to me, and I think that's because of the feel of what the translators were going for. They wanted it to be more poetic, so they really worked hard to make it that way.
Yeah. I think for me, and I think a lot of people that I've interacted with kind of share this, there's actually a distrust a little bit, and I don't know why this is, but like I hear about a new translation of the Bible, and like my first thought is like, whoa, and maybe there's even this feeling that, the older, the more established, the better the translation. And yet, the more that I talk with different people, I feel like, no, like you're saying with that the gentleman that wrote the books behind you, where maybe we're coming at new translations with a better understanding of the original language. Would you say there are cases where new translations are we're taking a step backwards, but then there's also translations where we are legitimately taking steps forward?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that I found, so I have this book called Bible Translations for Everyone that's coming out. And what I do is the first couple chapters, it's basically the conversation we've been having, how Bible translation works, how that translation spectrum works. But then I hop into the timeline of English Bibles and I go chronologically. And what I discovered as I was researching was that the translations that have been developed over the last 20 or 30 years were definitely kind of having a conversation with one another. There were translators who were looking at, okay, they did this, and we're not actually really thrilled about that decision, so we want to try to do this. And they did that, and we're not really sure that was the right decision, so we want to do this. So there is a little bit of a dialogue happening with translations. I would say that the ones that I focused on in my book are translations that I think are trustworthy, that the people who did them in good faith, and I think that's the best way to consider it. There are translations out there that if people ask me, I say, you should probably avoid that because it's a little bit suspect. But for the most part, I think that what they're trying to do is say, we want to do this. Obviously, I say in the book, there's the translation philosophy, there is the text that they're using, because there are, as you probably know, thousands and thousands of Greek manuscripts, everything from the form of full codexes of the entire New Testament to just little fragments on papyri of the New Testament. And so there is a system, a scientific process where all of that stuff is cataloged and researched. And so that process of textual research, and new things are discovered every year. And so these biblical scholars are looking at all the latest discoveries and going, okay, how do we put this in there? Does this change the way we want to phrase that verse? Do we think we found a better original Greek version? And so all of that gets tweaked a little bit. A really good example is back in the 1940s, a shepherd out by the Dead Sea was taken, I think it was sheep or goats or something, and he came across these caves at Qumran, which is, I've actually been there, right by the Dead Sea, and they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And these were copies, manuscripts of almost the entire Old Testament that were like 1,000 or 1,100 years older than the texts we were using for all of our best translations of the Old Testament. And what they found was that those things that they discovered that were 1,000 years older, closer to when they were originally written, actually supported what we had already had. There was a few tweaks that needed to be made, and you'll even see, if you look closely in your Bibles, you'll see some footnotes that say, the Dead Sea Scrolls had a little bit of a tweak here, and they'll put that as like a footnote. And so that's one of the cool things about all of these new translations. Yeah, I see how people would be a little bit wary, but most of the time it's, hey, we've done, or another good thing is translation updates. There are certain translations where every 5 to 10 years they say, we're going to do a light revision to what we did a few years ago because we've looked at all the latest research, all the latest data, and we think that this is actually closer to what the original wording of the text was, the way we're translating it in English. And so, yeah, I think it's okay for us to be concerned about that and to be thoughtful about it, but to also do a little bit of research and figure out why they're making the decisions. And most of these big English translations will produce like a almost like a research paper saying, here's why we are making the changes we're making to these texts that we're updating.
That's really neat. I know that there's a lot that goes behind the scenes that we're not even aware of. We just kind of open our Bibles and don't realize the thought and the work that went behind all that. I know for a lot of us, especially if we've grown up in a Christian home or if we've been at church for a while, we kind of just have the Bible that we've used or that was given to us, or like the kind of the de facto translation. When you talk about it in your book and on your website and YouTube channel, you talk about choosing a translation. I know you're thinking about it from the perspective of reading and studying, and obviously I'm coming at it a little bit from the memorization side, right? And I get that question a lot. What translation should I memorize? And that's, I feel like for me, it's not an easy answer. And I'd be curious to know when you're talking with somebody and they're asking you, hey, how do I choose the right translation for me, which I think is kind of even the basis of this your whole book, or at least maybe the last half of it. Give us a little bit of a kind of overview of what the book says or what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think the question I was asking when I started writing this book was what you asked earlier. Why do we have so many translations? maybe a second question, what makes them different? So I'm explaining the differences between them. What I've realized now, as I've even started to do podcast interviews and talk to people about the book as it gets closer to coming out, is that one of the questions that I'm able to answer in the book is helping people think, why do I read the translation that I read? Because for a lot of people, like me, I share this in the book. I grew up on the NIV because I was a child of the 80s and the 90s, and it felt like everybody in America read the NIV, you know? And it was like there was a couple of options. There was fewer than there are now. And then when we were students at Belmont, the ESV came out. And I remember people started talking about the ESV. And so the reason I switched was because peer pressure. Everybody else was reading the ESV, so I did. And so now what's cool about the book is that I'm able to help people understand this is how this translation was developed. This is where it sits on the spectrum. This is the flavor and the feel of it. I give, in every chapter, on every translation, I give example verses, the same verses, so you can flip back and forth and see the comparison of how this verse reads in the NKJV versus the NIV versus all of the other translations to kind of get a feel for it. And so what I hope people do is go, oh, I'm actually going to sit down and look at all these different translations, look at the best ones available to me and go, okay, which one, when I read about how it was developed and what its translation philosophy is, and I actually read the verses, which ones do I think are the best fit for me? Obviously, I think any translation that's one of these good ones can be a good fit for you. And spoiler alert, at the end of the book, I say, what if you picked a translation from over here on the spectrum and one from over here on the spectrum, and you used both of them a little bit so you make sure that you get a well-rounded view of Scripture from an accuracy and a readability side and kind of really find that. And then my question, my answer to which one should you use for memorization is probably the one that is easiest for you to follow along with, and it's familiar to you. I found that the NIV is rooted in my life because it's the translation that I was memorizing in Sunday school, and I was in a program called Awana at my church when I was a kid. And so a lot of times now I'll think of a verse in my head, and the way that it's worded in my mind, it goes back to the translation that I had as a child. So actually, I've actually kind of gone back to reading the NIV more because it's kind of in my heart a little bit. And then I tell people a lot of times, if you are rooted in a local church, you should ask your pastor, which translation are you going to be preaching from all the time or the most? Because that's a good way to be in community with other people and to have that connection. And that way you can always surf around on an app on your phone or on the internet and find some other translations and compare and contrast. But have one that's kind of your daily reader and the one that you're going to try to commit to memory so that there's like some sort of consistency in there. And then the other part is, when you get to the New Testament, a lot of the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament. And so it's good to make sure that you're using the same translation, because sometimes you'll be memorizing something that you're quoting from over here. If you've memorized the Old Testament passage, it'll just be easier for you if you're doing the same translation in the New Testament.
Yeah. I found that for people that are basically starting off as newer believers or people that are newer in the Word, it's a lot easier because it's, well, just choose whatever translation, like you said, that feels well or feels comfortable for you and that, really rolls off of your tongue. But you're right. For those of us that grew up in the church, I grew up and I actually went to a private school that was Baptist-based. And so King James Version was just pounded in there. And so there are certain verses that doesn't matter how much I work on it, it always comes out KJV.
Yep.
And then I originally memorized the book of James in King James Version, and I can't unmemorize it and redo it in a different. And so, one of the things I've told people is I actually have memorization in multiple translations, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Right? Like I memorized the book of James in King James Version, and then a lot of everything else I've done has been in the NIV.
Yeah. And
then I've done a little bit in the ESV, and I have no problem with that whatsoever. It just kind of boils down to what's going to actually encourage you to memorize and keep you in God's Word. That's probably the Bible you should be using.
Sure. I find that the KJV is actually one of the good things about the KJV, even though a lot of the wording is not the way we talk today. That actually helps us. I think the uniqueness of it the fact that it's different from the way you and I speak right now is actually helping us memorize it, because it gives us those little nods to kind of root it in there. And for those poetic portions that we talked about earlier, the KJV, I mean, there's second to none. It is so beautiful in the Psalms. It is so well worded, and people talk about it as like it was the Bible of Shakespeare. I think he probably actually was using something else that was a little bit before that, but still, it's that language that I think is so beautiful. It just kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit, which is really cool. But you're right. It's finding something that you can just dive into and spend time with, and more important than probably, I mean, as much as I love Bible translations, and I'm obviously a nerd about it right now, I think the bigger thing is just to be in the Word, find something, be consistent, and for what you're talking about, just to take those verses and really infuse them into your life. And I found one of my things that I've been doing is listening to the Bible. My whole channel has been about helping people find a Bible, a physical copy of the Bible, because part of my story is I was just spending so much time like reading the Bible on my phone or my laptop that I really just wanted a great physical copy of the Bible to disconnect from the virtual world and just spend time with the Bible. But I have found a couple of audio Bible apps that if I want to like really dwell on Scripture, actually, no pun intended, one of those apps is called Dwell. If I want to really dwell on Scripture, if I want to start to memorize, if I listen to it on repeat, that's really, really helpful for me in terms of like really letting it kind of sink into my life.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I want to give you an opportunity. You've talked about the book a lot, obviously because you're excited about it, but I know how much work that represents. I know it's up for pre-order right now. You want to share anything about, when it's coming out and all the details?
Yeah, the official launch date. The book is being published by a publisher called Zondervan Reflective. They're part of HarperCollins Christian Publishing, and it comes out on November 19th, 2024. I think the international release date is a little bit later in the year, but they're trying to get that out as soon as possible. And there's a page on my website. It's just timwildsmith.com/Bible translations for everyone that has some information about the book, some links to where you can pre-order a copy. And the publisher's doing something really fun. Anyone who pre-orders the book, they give them a little bit of early access to some material from the book, my version of the translation spectrum that we talked about, as well as a special video that I made for people who pre-order. And then we're also entering everyone into a drawing to win a really nice premium Bible from a company called Schuyler Bibles here in the United States, who makes Bibles in lots of different translations. So we're going to let them choose a Bible in a translation of their choice and give that to someone who pre-orders it. So yeah, the whole goal of the book was, like I said, to explain why we have so many translations and give people a look at it. I did a lot of research, but it's not an academic book. It's called Bible Translations for Everyone because it's an easy read. It's a fun read. There's charts and graphs and photos. It's really, if I do say so myself, it moves pretty quickly, and I have some fun with it. So hopefully for people who are interested in Bible translations or people who just love the Bible and are curious, it'll answer some of those questions and help them make a really informed decision about the translations that they use and read from on a daily basis.
Well, thanks again to Tim Wildsmith for joining us. If you want to learn more about his book and pre-order it, you can do that. There's going to be a link here as well as in the description of this video. He also has an excellent YouTube channel that I encourage you to subscribe to. You'll find that right here. And finally, I have my own video on choosing a translation to memorize. And if you want to watch that, I recommend you go watch that next. It'll kind of help you give even more context to some of this we've been talking about in this conversation. May the Lord bless you as you continue to memorize what matters. Take care.